Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box in your GoToWebinar control panel. They will be brought up at the end of the webinar in our Q&A session. Now I would like to turn the time over to Elaine Vanier, who is our presenter for today. Elaine, please go ahead and take it away.
Thanks very much, Sarah, and thank you everybody for attending today's webinar. And I'm just gonna get this, so I can advance this slide. What we're gonna talk about today is taking a look at an approach for conducting a hazard analysis, but for animal wellness and in the scope of aquaculture. And I just wanted to also highlight that we have some technical expertise also joining the call, and one of my colleagues, Tom White, who manages the NSF Seafood Division. So some of the questions I may pass over to him to help with responding to them, but just know that we've got a lot of expertise here and available on this webinar to answer your questions as we go through it. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is just a little bit about NSF, the background on the NSF Global Animal Wellness Standards, and then we're going to dive into this approach for conducting a hazard analysis for animal wellness for aquaculture species. This really does take a look at covering off some of the HACCP prerequisites and principles, and then we'll just wrap up the webinar, and then we'll handle the questions at the end of it. So I know in aquaculture there is a lot of familiarity with HACCP programs, but we're going to take a little bit of a different twist to it by looking at it from the perspective of animal wellness. My name is Elaine Vanier, and I have a degree in veterinary medicine. I'm the technical manager for NSF's animal wellness programs, and that typically covers all of the species that we have program services offered for. I linked up after developing the NSF Global Animal Wellness Standards with Tom White in our seafood division, and we found that it was a good stretch and a good fit for the aquacultural industry in terms of looking at animal wellness programs. So hopefully that makes sense to you as we go through it, and if you have any other questions about standards, we can also answer some of those at a later point. Just a little bit about NSF. We pride ourselves in that we are a global company, but in having that global reach, we also do have our teams locally located, so that wherever the industry is that we are providing services to, we know what that market looks like, we know what the requirements are, and we can help with preparing and providing services that are appropriate for those regions. We are located in over 175 country service offers with 61 office and laboratory locations, and that number is always changing as we go through the years. So what we're going to look at really stems back to the NSF Global Animal Wellness Standards, and if you've never heard of them or have not had a chance to look at them, they are available on the NSF website. We haven't yet published the version for aquaculture species. We're still looking at that, and hopefully we'll have that published so that it's available for you. But what I wanted to do was just give you a sense of what is covered in that Global Animal Wellness Standard. On the left-hand side is what we call the system components. The standards are based on ISO 34700, which is animal welfare management system. So it takes a management system approach to look at animal wellness programs that are in place at an operation. And the neat part about that is it is really going to give a really good oversight. And that management system and those system components actually work across all kinds of species, with livestock, poultry, and aquaculture species that are of interest. In that section on the system components, we look at the management commitment, policy, procedures, and planning, then how that animal welfare plan is implemented, monitored, and then the outcomes of that monitoring, focusing on personnel knowledge, skills, and competency, the facilities, equipment, and materials, and some focus on supplier and vendor approval systems, and then looking at it from an ongoing improvement perspective. On the right-hand side are the animal components, and these are pretty standard across all the species. We're finding there's a little bit of a difference, obviously, when we look at aquaculture species because the environment is very different. And so while I left it as feed and water, the water tends not to be an input into the animal as opposed to its environment. So we do look at it a little bit differently. But the rest of them, animal handling, husbandry and management, animal source, health and safety, and then the design, maintenance, and protection in the environment, facilities, and equipment. Those are all staying the same, and they essentially will just take a look at it from the perspective of the species that's in question. So in that management system, what we have covered in there is that there's an ability for the facility to demonstrate that they have a strong animal welfare management system in place. And it would apply to all of the relevant species that are managed at that facility and all of the life stages. And then what we're also looking at is sorry, I'm just going to move my control box because it's blocking a couple things. And so if you see my mouse moving around, it's just me playing around with my webinar box, control box. So we were looking at the animal welfare objectives that the organization has in place, that they get identified. Because in reality, if you don't really clearly identify what your objectives are, you don't actually have a way to determine whether or not you're meeting anything at all. So these are pretty standard requirements under a management system approach, but as you go through the standard, it also becomes a little bit more clear how to do that. We do have, going forward, we will be preparing an additional webinar specifically on the global animal wellness standards for aquaculture, so that at that point you would be able to get a more comprehensive picture and understanding of the standard and how it applies to that industry. But for the time being, what we're going to do is just pull out just a little bit out of the standard right now so that we can cover it off in this webinar and focus on the changing into looking at it from the hazard analysis perspective. So when we're looking at the management commitment, policy, procedures, and planning section of the system management components of the global animal wellness standards, there is a requirement to have a documented animal welfare plan that includes the procedures and operating protocols. There's also a requirement to have conducted a hazard analysis. This is pretty familiar, obviously, as I said earlier, for aquaculture, but tends to be on the food safety side. And what I also found in the other species that we've been looking at this in, the food safety side understands this component and the direction of moving through it. So I have a sneaking suspicion that in the aquaculture industry, the familiarity with taking a HACCP-like approach to a hazard analysis will make really good, clear sense. It just takes a little bit of a mind shift in when you're identifying the hazards, and that's where a lot of the energy and the input into thinking just a little bit differently than what you're used to when you think of a hazard analysis. So we're going to look at this, and again, as I say, starting with identifying the hazards, what control measures need to be put into place. Is there a requirement for any CCPs, and if there are, what those critical limits are? And to introduce you to another terminology here that I've discovered when I was taking a look at all the research and background information, what's out there already in terms of utilizing this approach for animal welfare and wellness, is a point of a particular attention, and there are associated tolerance limits with it. I'll explain a little bit more in depth about that when we get further on into the presentation. But just to give you a sense, they're somewhere between a prerequisite program and an actual critical control point. It's something that's really of importance, but it isn't as important or as critical as a CCP, but it still needs more focus than just a prerequisite program. Sometimes facilities find that a very useful approach, and hopefully we've identified a couple of examples that make sense for you. But if not, they don't have to be used. And then the last bullet on that slide is determining what are your indicators to let you know whether or not you're addressing the hazards that you have identified appropriately. Those indicators can be both animal-based or resource-based, and I'll give you a few examples of those a little bit later too. Okay, so when we look at it from the hazard analysis perspective, what's really important to keep in mind, and it becomes it becomes really clear when you start trying to work through this hazard analysis. But a lot of times animal management practices and processes are really directly intertwined with something else. So when you make a change in one area, it can have a very significant impact in another area. And being aware of that and understanding that connection actually will help with an operation to be able to identify how best to manage those areas and not negatively impact another related area. So what is recommended is taking a HACCP-based approach, but using the focus on animal welfare. That way, the facility can really get clear on identifying and controlling the threats that are of importance at that particular industry. But it also means that there's an opportunity throughout the supply chain to be able to take that similar approach. And I'll explain that a little bit later. But in reality, each facility is not a sole entity all on its own. There are inputs, there are outputs, there are services that are coming in and out of those facilities, and then you're part of a supply chain as well. So what we're trying to do is take this approach and make it work and make sense across the protein supply chain. And that is in doing that, what we've identified for the sets of standards that we've created are standards that apply to each point, relevant point in the supply chain. Okay. So what we're trying to, kind of impress here is that for primary producers, this is really a good mechanism to structure and formalize what's already being done, but it gives a better checks and balances opportunity. So when something goes wrong, it's easier to come back to your plan and your program and your hazard analysis and figure out what exactly is going wrong and how can I address it. And it helps really kind of structure that. For transporters, this is an opportunity to measure and monitor how well that handling and transport operation is being done. And for harvest operations, most likely is where you're going to see some of these CCPs identified. And when that's done, it often gives any facility, not just a harvest operation, but any facility an opportunity then to really start to make steady improvements, that ongoing improvement approach by taking a look at it this way. Okay, so what we're going to take a look at here is flowing through the HACCP. First step is the first 5 prerequisites. None of this should be new if you have a HACCP plan, but I'm just going to pop out a little poll question as I'm starting to go through this, and just to make sure we get take a look at this. Now, I know a lot of you will have HACCP plans in place on a food safety side, but I want to know the question here, and I'm going to launch this little poll out here now. It's coming out. We'll come back to it and kind of get a sense for it, but the poll is out there, and the question is, does your current HACCP program include aspects of animal welfare? Okay, so the first 5 steps, the 5 prerequisite steps, are first identify an animal welfare team. And we know, the approach here is to make sure that your team has an identified lead. That makes the best sense. But also the welfare team has to be made up of people that really do understand the operation. And there's a lot of different aspects of the operation that are impacted by decisions when you go through a hazard analysis. So, if you have a sanitation, someone who's responsible for sanitation, someone who's responsible for maintenance programs, those things, they contribute to the input to when you're doing this hazard analysis. So having a really clear cut. A lot of in harvest operations, what I'm finding too is usually there's also somebody on the food safety quality team involved in these teams, and that makes sense too because they really understand the flow through this hazard analysis perspective, and it seems to be a lot more easy for them to take that little mind switch and be able to say, yeah, I get how this is going to work from the animal welfare perspective. And I think you'll find too sometimes they've already got programs and directions in place that actually just need to be modified as appropriate for the animal welfare perspective. And so there's not a lot of, it's not like you always have to start from zero in a lot of these facilities. Okay, step 2 is identifying the scope of the animal production and then the products and the product information, what's coming out of your product, out of your facility. Second, identify the use and the consumers. So, is this something that's going to be used in animal feed? Is it a direct to a harvest operation for slaughter, for harvest and then consumption? What's the outcome of the product that you're producing? The 4th and the 5th are really, really critical steps in this process, and that is to create a flow diagram and then verify that flow diagram. And so when you can get that nicely structured and it makes sense for your facility, it will make a huge difference in your ability to really identify some of those areas that you need to focus on. So I just want to get to this next slide here. Okay, so again, identifying that animal welfare lead and the team, you want it to, as much as you can, to be multidisciplinary and facility based. There are some times where you're going to look for outside expertise on this, and that's okay too. But what you want to make sure is that there is somebody on that team who really knows that facility, really knows the processes that are happening there, and can put it all into the right context. So the scope of the production, this includes a facility description, what kind of production systems, the life stages of animals that you have at your facility, the production type. Are there any specific legislated or certification or customer requirements that define the process for you? And then the final products of your system and any exclusions. Identifying the use, the target market, and your specific customers. If it happens to be a specific client or customer or restaurant chain, identifying that because they may have specific requirements that are important for you. And the intended use. The 4th is that flow diagram. So this is going to give you a sense of the sequence and interaction of the elements in your process. You want to identify the inputs to your system, what services you have coming into them from an outside source, and then the outputs from your system as well. Creating that flow diagram. Some of the examples of the material inputs include, but not limited to, feeds and supplements, medications, some environmental contaminants, if that's of relevance, water circulation, air, purchased animals. Service inputs could include catching and loading and transport services or veterinary services. When you look at creating that flow diagram, this is just an example that we put together, but it gives you a general sense of how a flow diagram can look. And it really just takes you as a flow through. A lot of these boxes here are showing you the steps in your process in general. And then you have the indicators of the inputs into your system, the services that are coming into your system, and then your outputs. Okay, the real critical part about here is verifying that flow diagram, because you want to connect what it is you've just put on your flow diagram to your actual facility and how it's really operating. And I'm always pleased when I see operations that have aerial maps, even just a, kind of like an animated map of the layout of their facility. It really does help, but it really is critical for the animal welfare team to be able to take that flow diagram, verify it, and make sure that all of the things that are in that flow diagram really are reflecting what's going on. Sometimes there's discovery that there's something else that you just didn't consider when you first put it together. And sometimes there are different seasonal impacts that you have to take into account, because you might be doing the flow diagram at one point in the year, but it might be important at another time of year, another factor that you haven't thought about. Okay. Once you've got that first 5 prerequisites, we jump into the HACCP 7 principles. Again, these are probably very familiar looking to you from the perspective of your own HACCP plans that you've got in place. Okay. So the hazard identification starts is the starting point. The challenge here is how to list those hazards. And so I talk about how we have taken an approach for categorizing the hazards. And this is really just kind of reflecting the mechanism and terminology that you use to identify the hazards. And it can be very different. You can be very comfortable with the BCP, the biological, chemical, physical structure and approach to it. But there are other mechanisms of categorizing the hazards, animal welfare hazards. And so I'm going to kind of go through that just a bit to give you a better sense of how some people are representing those hazards. So again, you could use the BCP. Biological obviously would include things like the disease pathogens, parasites, and any feed-related contamination or sort. Hey, there's if it's an unacceptable species source and so forth. Chemical and radiological could include things like algae toxicity or contaminants that are coming into the system. And physical could be things like an aerator damage or non-function, injury from netting, or crushing from human activity in the pond itself. So obviously these are just examples and they may or may not apply to your facility, but it should give you a sense of how you can look at that BCP structure for categorizing and identifying your hazards. Another approach, and I find this one, from my own perspective, this one I find more comfortable. And it just comes down to things where you look at it from a perspective of what's a poor outcome, and that's the hazard you're trying to avoid. Under that poor outcome approach, you can look at it from the perspective of an animal-based poor outcome, a design-based poor outcome, or management-based. So a couple of examples from an animal-based poor outcome is that you have weight loss or poor body condition. You have a disease state of the animal. For example, there's sea lice. You have high mortality, unusual behavior. So these are just examples of something that's going on with the animal that is a poor outcome that you want to avoid. Design-based are things like inadequate dissolved oxygen levels or poor water quality, or perhaps insufficient space allowance. And then management-based are how to avoid poor approaches or strategies when you're managing the animals. For example, overfeeding or incorrect handling during loading. So this is another way of representing, and there's no one way that works. You could use a combination of ways of categorizing, as long as you do identify all of your hazards. One of the other ways of thinking about the hazards when you're identifying them is the impact. So there are things that are factors that are attributable to the animal itself. Things like male transformation, hybridized species that would allow for enhanced growth, or species being suited to a local climate or water temperature. And then there are factors that are directly impacting the animal, such as feed, water quality, and water temperature or handling, and so forth. And then other things that are indirectly impacting the animal, such as drought situations, local water or soil conditions, and maybe a surrounding environment impact, climate, or rainfall. So there's a lot of different ways of looking at those hazards. You just want to make sure that you understand your logic when you're identifying them, and go for it, because there's no right way, there's no wrong way in this approach. Okay. Once you've identified all your hazards, then the next step is to take a look at assessing each of those hazards and determine whether or not you need to do something to eliminate or reduce it to an acceptable level. And that will help you achieve your animal welfare objectives that you've already identified if you've gone through the management system approach to this. And then you're going to take a look at determining that whether or not a required control measure is needed. I like the grid on there for severity and likelihood, because the next step in this is taking a look at each hazard and determine the severity of adverse effects if you had no control, and the likelihood of their occurrence if you had no control. And this is really where a lot of the thought process has to come in understanding what it is your hazards are, and being able to identify the severity and likelihood. But the thing about this is, once that work is done, you can then put a lot of these hazards on this kind of a grid, and that determines where your priorities need to focus. So it's one of the best ways to kind of get clarity on which hazards are the most important to take a focus on first, if you can't do it all at once. So the methodology you use to assess should be described, and then you want to record the hazard assessment results. Okay, so once you've got all that assessment, now you know which hazards you want to control. Then it's a matter of figuring out at what level do you need to put in place a control measure, and what's the stringency of that. So I like this diagram because it kind of helps give you a little bit more of a structured approach to it. Sometimes you can manage these hazards quite nicely with an SOP that is just it's a protocol that's going to address it, and it doesn't become a big concern at all. It may be an entire prerequisite program that has to be put in place to manage it. There's that point of particular attention, or a CCP. And those are the higher levels. Those are the most high priority hazards that were identified. And so now you know where you need to focus your attention for the most part. But the important part is, in any of this, when you're working at, is these two foundational levels of this pyramid. When you've got that in place, sometimes operations really are finding they don't have to have too many CCPs or even points of particular attention. Okay, so taking a look at some examples of good prerequisite programs that are going to be able to handle a lot of the identified hazards. So, for example, the hazard identified is poor feed quality. The prerequisite program could be an approved supplier program for your feeds. Another hazard is animal loss due to predation. Your prerequisite program could be your facility design and maintenance. And then last example is disease outbreak is your hazard, and your sanitation program or your veterinary relationship can be another mechanism to have in place as a prerequisite program. So once you've got most of those things under control, utilizing some of those SOPs and prerequisite programs, this is where you'll take and identify if you need to have any critical control points. So that definition for the critical control point is that a CCP is needed where failure to control those hazards can lead to serious harm to people, animals, or equipment. And a CCP should have met these 5 criteria. It's associated with the hazard of concern. It's measurable and or observable. There are strict standards with a critical limit. Corrective actions are taken if you're outside of those critical limits, and that corrective action must reestablish full control of the process. Okay, so talk a little bit more here about whether or not you want to put in place any points of particular attention. We've defined the point of particular attention as a condition that could be threatening to animal health, welfare, public health, or on-farm management. But in these cases, typically there are no strict standards or thresholds, and they've not been or cannot be defined. A lot of times these come down to things of importance at an individual facility based on their own objectives and management strategies and approaches. And so sometimes these are very unique to a facility. So I'll give you a few examples of that. First of all, okay, on the left-hand side, a few examples of some production of some CCPs. So at a production level, CCP, it could be the number of DOAs in fingerlings that are received at the facility. transport CCP could be the oxygen levels in the transport container, and a harvest CCP could be an effective bleed out. So on the right here is a few examples of some points of particular attention that may not have some strict limits on them. But so for production, cull rate during grow out. You may want to have an improvement from whatever your current one is, your baseline, to a new and improved cull rate. Another production one is having uniform fish size in your pond or cage. And another example from a harvest, a point of particular attention would be the duration of holding fish in holding wells prior to harvest. So sometimes, in some cases, a lot of times what we're finding is when companies are focusing on these points of particular attention, they may utilize this as an initial strategy to determine, is it important enough to actually then turn it into a CCP later? But if you're not sure, you can actually take this approach and kind of help focus attention on these areas because you're measuring them. Okay. Once you've identified your critical control points and, if it's appropriate, points of particular attention, for the CCP, you identify your critical limits. So this is a criterion that separates acceptability from unacceptability. In points of particular attention, we identify those limits as a tolerance limit. It means you can work within those tolerances, but going outside of them doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have a complete failure of anything, but it's not where the facility wants to be. So, and a lot of times determining these critical limits or tolerance limits can be aligned with industry best practices. A lot of times CCPs are aligned with regulations or specific customer requirements, if that applies, or other certification requirements. So there's a lot of sources for determining where those limits can come from, and that will be helpful when you design your program. Okay. So examples of some critical limits for production CCP, we said that the CCP was the number of DOAs and received fingerlings, and a critical limit could be set at 5% or less. So, you know, you have that in place. An example of a tolerance limit for from points of particular attention, we mentioned having uniform fish size in the pond or the cage. Your tolerance could be set at 95% uniformity. Another point of particular attention we identified was at harvest, the duration of holding fish in holding wells, and that tolerance limit could be set at held for 1 hour only. So it just gives you an idea of how some of those critical limits and tolerance limits look, so that you can decide whether those are appropriate for your facility or operation. Okay, once you've got all that, now you determine how are you going to monitor that your CCPs and your point of particular attention to make sure that they're staying within line of your critical limits or tolerance limits. And so you want to make sure that you're choosing an observation or a measurement that will actually demonstrate if this control point is operating as intended. Then once you've got that, oh, I wanted to mention this one too, because I had kind of previously mentioned, but this last little bullet on the stage, sometimes when you start measuring things in your points of particular attention, it actually gives you a little bit more objective evidence, and you can make a decision on whether or not it can be moved down to a prerequisite program or escalated to a CCP. Okay. So when you're taking a look at monitoring and the indicators and measures that you're utilizing, you want to be able to make sure that you can actually use something that's going to effectively give you the right information. So the types of indicators or measures can be described as either animal-based criteria, design-based criteria, or operation criteria. So this is very familiar in terms of when you're looking back at your hazard identification. But the animal-based criteria will directly assess the state of the animals. Design assesses the environment, and operation assesses your handling and your management practices. The indicators must use a scoring system that is objective, consistent, and repeatable by and between assessors. And so sometimes coming up with those, if you haven't done this before, can be a challenge, but there are a lot of good examples out there already in place. So once you've got that, now you know you're monitoring, you know whether or not your activities or your situations are within control or not. When they're not, when they're outside of critical limits or tolerances, then corrections and corrective actions would need to be taken when those limits are exceeded. With a CCP, the typical approach is to identify what the root cause is. Sometimes going back to your hazard analysis will help with that process. But then there has to be an action taken to bring that parameter back in control and another action to prevent any further recurrence of it. So sometimes what's most important in this is when something bad happens in these, you have an animal that is directly impacted. It's not a static product that has no feelings. You have a live animal that's impacted. So the initial approach to this really does have to consider specific immediate corrections and or those longer term or shorter term corrective measures, but you have to address the animals that have been impacted by it. And then there is a strong focus on prevention of recurrence of this. Okay. The next key step in this is now to establish the procedures to verify that your verify the control measures. So these are ensuring that your measures are implemented, monitored, and recorded as designed. Those are verification activities. So you've got it in place and you're making sure it's done as you've designed it. The validation activities will determine if the control measures, if they're properly implemented, have actually effectively controlled the hazards that you intended them to control. So both those activities, usually the expectation is a validation is done before you implement the control program. So that's the best approach to it. Once you've then implemented, you'd be doing verification activities. But on a regular basis, a revalidation will determine, is that control measure still doing what I expect it to do? Or do I need to make any modifications? So that becomes part of your ongoing control or ongoing improvement and the way you look at your programs and your plans in place. Okay. The last step, obviously very clear, very familiar to you, is make sure you've established effective record-keeping procedures that will help you to demonstrate that your program has been implemented and working the way you intended it to work. So there's a lot of times what we found is some companies are going, well, I'm not sure if I have anything in place. If you've got HACCP plans already, and let me just go back here, I'm just going to take a look at the poll here, just kind of give a sense where we're taking a look at this. It's going to go to the okay, so I think this should be showing you the poll results. Just going to double check on here. Yep. Okay, so you can see the question answered is that majority, 67%, so 2/3 probably have not included animal welfare hazards in their HACCP program. But nice to see, really interested in getting feedback sometimes from companies that actually say, yes, we have incorporated those into our HACCP program. So I'm glad to see that, and I think there's gives everybody a lot of information to kind of think about that, and you know, kind of see how does that impact on what you want to do going forward. Okay, let me get back to my screen. Oops, somebody's helping me. Okay, let's make sure you're seeing there. Okay, so we're back here. So that means then where you can, if you haven't already started this process, take advantage of what you got in your existing HACCP program documentation, your protocols and procedures, any health plans you have already, and your record formats that you've got already in place, and decide, do you have evidence here, objective evidence you can already utilize to help answer your questions about your animal welfare risks and hazards? Or do you need to add and tweak a little bit? So a lot of times it's not starting from zero. Sometimes you can actually take advantage of what you've already got in place. Okay, so when we put that all together, what we're looking at when we go in and assess management system documentation is we would be looking for hazard analysis that's in place, the CCP, and if applicable, appointed particular attention determination and the critical limit determination. So you want to be able to kind of demonstrate why and how you chose some of those points and the limits. And then we look for records, including the CCP monitoring activities, when there's deviations and the associated corrections and corrective actions. And then if there were any in an ongoing review of the system, any modifications to it. Okay. So not to leave you completely empty-handed, as we work forward on this approach, one of the things we did, and it helped in some of the workshops we've been delivering on doing these hazard analysis, is create some tools and resources for learning opportunities, but also I think they've been used effectively by some facilities that have reached out for access to them. They are simple templates for your animal welfare team, your facility description, process flow. You saw an example of one of those in the presentation so far. A hazard analysis template and the control points template. We have one of those as well. And the ultimate goal here, and this is where I'm relying a lot on input from Tom White and his team on NSF Seafood Division, and that is to create some generic models for the industry to be able to take as a starting point. Obviously, every time you look at a generic model or even a template, you're going to want to adapt it and make it work for your facility. But, you know, kind of giving a little bit of a starting point to think from is going to be very useful. Additionally, once we get those tools, you know, really fleshed out nicely, when we get those generic models, then we would have an opportunity then to provide some sort of further webinars and workshops. If you're interested, if you want to get a little bit more information on it, on the standards, on some of these templates, or even future information about webinars or workshops, because we can do general workshops, or we can do specific to your facility workshops, whatever works for your industry or your facility. Just let us know, and we'll have some contact information available for you. But the next part of this, and I've covered all the slides I want to go to, so what I hope to focus on now for the last part of the webinar time frame here is to go into our questions and kind of see if we've got any identified. If you do, just type them into the chat box and it'll come into the control panel for us. We'll be able to see your questions. So the other option is you can raise a hand and we'll be able to kind of answer any questions that you have. So I'm just kind of scroll through some of the, see if there's anything identified right now. So I'm not seeing any questions right now. I'm just going to see if I've got another additional slide here. I do. This is the contact information. So that's information from me, the technical manager for the animal wellness programs and supply chain, and Tom White, who's our global manager for NSF Seafood. So that's our contact information. If you have any other questions after the webinar, if you haven't thought of any just yet, that's fine. You can send them to us, or if you want any further information on some of those templates I mentioned, or even just kind of have a conversation about what direction you might want to move in for your facility, just let us know. You can always reach out to www.nsf.nsf.org. As I said, the global animal wellness standards that I mentioned at the start of this webinar are there. We don't have the aquaculture ones published yet, but if you'd like some input on the aquatic standards, just let us know, send us a question. I guess there's no questions still coming up, so that's probably a good thing. The other thing I was going to mention is this webinar is recorded. So as a participant, you will be able to get access to the recording afterwards. And so there's an opportunity for you to review it. I know it's a lot of information covered in a short period of time. And so I hope that somebody is, getting some info. Oh, it looks like I've got some questions. So we'll take a look at this. Okay. All right. Okay, cool. Thanks everybody for providing some of the input in the, where you're coming from, what you're doing in terms of the part of the industry. We're just kind of going through here. Okay. Here we go. Okay. So let's start with a good one. Okay. So first question is, how does one compare hazards given the broad nature of welfare? What I found is if you take a look at it specific to your facility is where you can really define it. Again, I think this is where our work that we're working on now in terms of the generic models is going to give us a good starting point. It is a broad nature. What I wanted to be able to help make it more simple is this. When we design the global animal wellness standards, it is focusing on those key elements in the program requirements: food and water, the environment, the animal health source, and so forth, and the handling. When you break it down to those 4 key areas, then it becomes a little bit easier to focus on what are the key risks and hazards that you need to pay attention to. I think one of the things in answer to that question is that as we start taking this approach to it and thinking it through, I'm working right now on a generic set of models for the poultry industry. And it's interesting because sometimes, the things we are real familiar with, it's easy to write those down, but then it helps us really have something that we can visually challenge and take a look at and go, oh, wait a minute, I didn't think of that. Somebody else has shown that. But sometimes it just helps you get it clear for what's going on in your facility. So these are not meant to be one size fits all. They are real, like any HACCP plan. They have to start with some industry norms as your basic foundation, but every time when you look at it, you're going to make it specific for your facility, the specific operations, the specific species, and so forth. Okay, so hopefully that will help. Okay. And I think what I'm going to do too is just let you know, some of these questions are a little in depth, and what I'm going to do too is we're going to take these questions and we're going to probably provide we're going to put together a written response, and then we'll be able to send those back directly to you. But we'll also share some of the general questions and kind of give you guys a little bit more of an understanding based on some of the questions that come up. Do we also define standards for the ornamental fish sector? So typically, and that's always a good question. And I remember, so just a bit of my background, before I joined NSF, I actually worked up in the Canadian government and was working with our aquaculture programs division up there. And the question always came down to, do you want to work with programs that are looking at ornamental species as well as those that are for consumable products? The fish in the ornamental sector, I think the standards could apply, but typically NSF's approach is to look at a species, whether it's livestock, poultry, or aquaculture species, where there's a consumed product, such as meat in this case. So ornamental fish sector wouldn't typically be something we would normally cover, but having said that, I think these standards and this approach would definitely be applicable. So the standards that that we're preparing for the aquaculture sector will not be specific to species necessarily. They will make sense once we start looking at them and pulling to sort of a category of species. So I think a lot of times what I've seen and noted is that some of those ornamental fish species actually fit into some of those quite nicely. I think at some point there is no reason to not think about how we can go forward with some of these different sectors. Okay, can we share the PowerPoint? The PowerPoint is actually part of the presentation, so you'll see it again when you get the recording. Just scroll down here. Okay. Yep, okay, so we got that one. All right, and a couple more questions. We also share the templates. So if you want access to the templates, just send me or Tom White an email. The addresses are there on the screen, and we can follow up with you and get those out to you. As I say, they're very generic, but they are useful tools as a starting point. Okay, next one is the plans need to be harmonized with other BMPs and welfare codes of practice, such as those published by National Farm Animal Care Council in Canada. True and good point. One of the things that we have always done in the drafting of the standards, the global animal wellness for livestock and poultry that are already published and the aquaculture that we're working on right now, is taking a look at what's existing and out there already. Because this is a management system approach, there is already a slightly different outlook to it. The standards themselves, just to give you a little bit more background on those, and hopefully what we'll do is in the short term be able to provide you with another follow-up webinar on those standards itself. But the standards are outcome-based and they're not prescriptive. So if there's any prescriptiveness required, a lot of times you won't see that in the global animal wellness standards, but it will require the facility to define that. And a lot of times, this is where sometimes another best management practice or a code of practice will actually be something that's referenced. And it's not referenced necessarily in the standard, but it would be expected to be referenced if you were in an area that would be an important reference material. So what I'm trying to say is when I go into a facility and they say, oh, this is part of my program here, and I would go, okay, where did you find that? What did you base that on? And if they said, well, I based it on the National Farm Animal Care Council, then I would go, okay, that's appropriate. If they did not, and they should have, a lot of time, and this is again going back to our ability to be familiar with what's important in different locales, then we would ask them or challenge them. So why has it not been considered? But at the same time, you kind of want the standard itself to make sure that there's nothing out of line with it. So a lot of times we've been doing direct benchmarking just to make sure that we've got those things covered. But there's a couple of ways then to make sure that those industry best practices and so forth are, yeah, that they are addressed. There's another comment here that ornamentals is the consumed product. Yep, as soon as I said that, I went, yeah, wait a minute. That's the truth, but it's not for human consumption. Like they're not going to eat it, they're not going to wear it, they're not going to so forth. It's a slightly different thing, but as I said, I think we can we'll keep that in mind as we're going through the drafting process to make sure that, you know, if it could fit with ornamentals really nicely, I'd be real happy. But again, that's not typically the focus that we've done. Okay. We've got a couple more. I think we've got all of our questions covered so far. So again, if you have any other questions, if they come to you, come to mind afterwards, you always have our contact information. You will receive the recorded webinar at a later point once it's all prepared and available. And so there's always opportunities for you to follow up on this. I'd be real happy to hear if there's anybody interested in taking a look at going through this process, working with us, and we'd be more than happy to help support that. And, you know, because this is a whole learning process across the industry, taking this kind of a perspective. It's very new. I know I mentioned the ISO standard that it's based on, but that was released in December of 2016. So it's really not been that long since it's been released, and there are no other standards out there that are based on that except for specific ISO standards. So I think that there's an opportunity here for a lot of the industry to take another look at how they manage animal welfare and just see if there's a better way of doing it. We think we have it, and we're kind of hoping that you see it the same way. And happy to hear from you if you do have any questions or comments. And on that note, we've kind of run out of our time on the hour. So I want to say thank you very much for your participation, and hope you all stay safe.